Good afternoon, and welcome to another Research in Action, brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. My name is Karen Scapinato. I will be today's moderator. Before we get started, as always, just a few logistics. We will take questions from the audience. We really would like your questions, but you will have to type those questions. If you open up the Q&A button, if you hover your mouse in the bottom of your screen, you see a Q&A icon there. If you click on that, a little pop-up comes up and you can type your question there. And you can type your question at any time during today's presentation. We will get to them at the end of the presentation today. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker that I look very much forward to. Dr. Oliver Buckton is professor and chair of the Department of English at Florida Atlantic University, and he teaches courses in Victorian and modern British literature, film, literary theory, and espionage fiction, and that will be the topic of his talk today. He will talk about Ian Fleming and his books on James Bond. Enjoy. Dr. Buckton, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Scarpinato, for inviting me to present in the Research in Action series. And thanks also to Janelle Wild-Goose-Carroll for assistance with setting things up. So I'm going to share my screen. First of all, just welcome to GoldenEye. This is the beautiful Jamaican home where Ian Fleming wrote all of the James Bond novels and stories. And I'm actually at his desk here in GoldenEye, which was placed in the corner because Fleming didn't want to be distracted by the beautiful views over the Caribbean Sea when he was writing. So that's where we are today. Can everyone see?
Yes, looks good. Thank you.
Okay, great. So yeah, we're going to be meeting the creative mind of James Bond and also the creative mind behind James Bond, that of Ian Fleming. So this is basically based on my biography of Ian Fleming, which I have here. There's a cover. Here's the real thing, the finished product. I don't know if it's visible, maybe not, but it's a biography published 2021, and it's really the first in-depth exploration of the entire process. I really wanted to focus on Fleming as a writer and the whole process of his craft, from conception of the plots to the composition at GoldenEye to revision and publication. I also wanted to focus on his intelligence work in World War II, and I'll be talking about that as well in this presentation. I also offer I think it's fair to say, a radically new view of Fleming's relationships with women. Particularly tracing how the characters we often know as Bond girls, Fleming's heroines, were based on a number of very strong, independent, intelligent women that he knew and loved in life. And then my biography touches on or more than touches on it, really delves into the relationship to the natural environment. I'll be referring to that a little bit as well. But as all researchers know, books are the final product, but they do emerge from a long process of research. So I just wanted to briefly mention a couple of the archives that I worked in. First of all, the Lilly Library, Bloomington University, Indiana University, holds the Ian Fleming manuscripts, and this is an invaluable source for anyone researching Ian Fleming. It has 12 of the typescripts of the James Bond stories. And that's when you really get to see all the revisions that Fleming made and see how much effort he really put into his craft as a writer. It also contains typescripts of lesser known works, non-fiction works such as The Diamond Smugglers, Thrilling Cities, a travelogue, and perhaps most surprising of all, State of Excitement, a book about Kuwait, which he never actually published for complicated legal reasons. But it also houses Fleming's collection of rare first editions. Another archive that I was very fortunate to access was the Jonathan Cape archive. That was Fleming's publisher, Jonathan Cape, and they have a comprehensive record of his correspondence with publishers, agents, readers, which is really a fascinating perspective on how engaged he was with the whole process of producing his books. And this is housed at the University of Reading in the UK. So those are two of the key sources. I'm going to talk now about Ian Fleming, the man who created James Bond. who may seem to be like the eternal hero, part of our popular culture, almost part of our mythology. But he actually first appeared in 1953 in the first Bond novel, Casino Royale. Here's a cover of the early edition. And Fleming was a voracious reader. He was influenced by other characters and writers, including Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective, and Richard Hannay, a previous spy hero by the Scottish author John Buchan. And Fleming was very conscious of his own Scottish ancestry. His father was Scottish, his grandfather as well, and Fleming was very conscious of that. So both these characters were created by Scottish authors. As I'll talk about, his World War II experience in naval intelligence was a key source. But he was already planning to write what he called the spy story to end all spy stories. So he set himself a pretty high bar there with to write the best spy story of all time. But he certainly might argue he succeeded. Casino Royale was timed to coincide with the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, who, as we know, recently died after the longest reign in British history. And so the royale of the title was timed to reflect the coronation of the Queen. But it also, of course, used the gambling games as the center of the story. Where did the name James Bond come from? This is an interesting story. According to Fleming, he was working on his spy story, and at GoldenEye in 1952. He was struggling to find a name for the title and the character. He really didn't want to use the more traditional sort of English gentleman spy names like Peregrine Carruthers was an example he gave. And he wanted something much more flat and direct. And so, as Fleming tells it, he was looking around his bookshelves in Jamaica, and he saw this book, which one of his Bibles, as he put it, as a keen bird watcher, Field Guide to the Birds of the West Indies. And the author was a man called James Bond. And so Fleming just pinched the name, basically, made no apology for just using the name of a pretty well-known author in ornithology. Here we have two images of the original James Bond, above and below. And eventually Fleming kind of admitted to the owner of the name that he'd stolen it, and offered him the use of the name Ian Fleming if he ever wanted it. But in any case, it's interesting because it does tell us something about James Bond. I believe that he was named after an ornithologist. He was someone who loves the natural world and makes a study of it. And part of my argument in the biography is that James Bond, perhaps surprisingly, is actually a kind of environmentalist in certain ways, and certainly a protector of the natural world, and especially of birds. So that's one of the kind of what seems to be a coincidence is really, I argue, more meaningful. So a little bit about Fleming's background. He came from a very wealthy, privileged background. His grandfather, Robert Fleming, was a self-made millionaire. He invested heavily in railways in the United States, and actually lived in the US for some time. Originally, though, from Dundee in Scotland. So Fleming was born into wealth, and he born in Mayfair, which is a very exclusive area of London. And really his whole life was marked by this privilege socially. He attended Eton College, which is perhaps the most famous public school in the UK, very, very elite school. But he left under a cloud. He wasn't very successful at school. And there were some scandals involving women, and he ended up going to military academy at Royal Sandhurst. He wasn't that interested in a military career, however, so he dropped out and didn't graduate. So he struggled to find his way in life, despite the privilege of his background. A turning point, though, was when Fleming was sent by his mother to study at Kitzbühel in Austria, to study at a place called the Villa Tennerhof, which is a private school set up by an English couple. And this was a turning point because the influence of this couple was almost like sort of parent figures for Ian Fleming. They shaped him in many ways. He was there to study languages because his new plan of life was to enter the Foreign Office. And for those who've read much spy fiction, you'll know that there's a close connection, or indeed history of intelligence. There's a close connection between the Foreign Office and espionage. Basically, the Foreign Office was a cover for much of Britain's espionage activity. And so Fleming knew that being in the Foreign Office was a step towards becoming a spy. He was influenced by Ernest Forbes Dennis, who ran the school, who had been a former spy in Europe, and his wife was a famous novelist, Phyllis Bottom. And so we can see two parts of Ian Fleming's life: the spy ambitions and the writing ambitions coming together in this place. And Phyllis Bottom, in fact, encouraged him to write and to write his first short story. Another interesting influence was that the couple were disciples, basically, of the psychologist Alfred Adler, and Phyllis Bottom actually wrote Adler's biography eventually. And one of the key influences was the idea of this sort of family position defining one's identity. And they had a concept, Adler had a concept called the Gegenspieler, as a kind of a sibling rival that one would compete with for attention from parents, for approval, for success. And this was, Ian's position in relation to his older brother, Peter. Here's a picture of the two. Ian was actually larger, physically more imposing than Peter, but Peter had the advantage of being academically brilliant. And so Fleming's early life, it was very mixed. He had an early trauma when his father, Valentine, was killed in World War I. And this was a tragedy that Ian was really marked by for the rest of his life. So he was raised really by his mother, Eve. And so despite his studies of languages and his gift at languages, he failed to get the job in the Foreign Office. So he had to go to elsewhere, and he turned to journalism, and he worked for Reuters, the news agency. He got a break when he was sent to Moscow to cover the Metro Vickers trial, which was a huge scandal, basically a show trial that Stalin was trying to kind of humiliate the British by charging some of its engineers from Metro Vickers with espionage. And so Fleming wrote reports on these trials, and it kind of made him as a journalist. Later, he would be hired by the Foreign Office to write a report on Russia. Fleming was fascinated by Russia, as you can see clearly from the Bond novels. Russia is the kind of the bête noire of the Bond novels, but SMERSH in particular, its secret intelligence organization. But Fleming was fascinated by the country, and he wrote a report about Russia before World War II. Just to go touch a bit more on Peter Fleming. This was Ian's older brother, and I argue that he was a key figure in Ian's eventual success, because Peter was a successful writer as well. He started much earlier in the 1930s. He wrote a bestseller called Brazilian Adventure, which was based on a sort of failed mission to find a missing English explorer in the Amazon jungle. Sounds very kind of like a Bond adventure almost, but it was a non-fiction travelogue. It was a bestseller, and so Peter Fleming was launched on his career, and he had several more great successes. So Ian, who was sort of had ideas of his own about writing, felt intimidated by that. And a turning point then was later in his career, in the 1950s, Peter wrote a spy novel called The Sixth Column, which was a sort of almost a kind of spoof of spy fiction. It was very different than anything Ian wanted to write, but it was a spy novel, and it was published. And I argue that this publication in 1952 was the final catalyst that got Ian to sit down and write his first novel, Casino Royale. He didn't want Peter to have all the success, particularly as he'd already planned to write. He told friends, I'm going to write the spy story to end all spy stories. Both brothers worked in intelligence in World War II, but Ian's influence was especially important on James Bond. In naval intelligence, despite having no military background other than Royal Sandhurst, he was appointed as a deputy or the assistant to the director of naval intelligence, and which is a huge responsibility for someone particularly had no naval background. But he charmed his way into the job effectively, and he worked under Admiral John Godfrey, the director, who became the model for Bond's boss, M. Although Bond is in the Secret Intelligence Service, his equivalent position of M is based on Godfrey. Also, Fleming reached the rank of commander in the Navy with his position, Commander Fleming, and he gave the same rank to Bond, which tells us again that how much Bond is based on Fleming's own life. Here's Bernard Lee, who played M in the early movies for quite some time, actually. Fleming got involved in some pretty crucial missions or operations in naval intelligence. One well known is called the Operation Mincemeat. It's a very elaborate deception plot to deceive Nazi Germany into thinking that the Allies were planning to invade Greece rather than the actual target of Sicily. And this involved creating a fake character called Captain William Martin, or Captain Major, actually. He eventually was given that rank. And they found a corpse that they dressed up and created this fictional identity of Major Martin. Gave him a naval identity card, as you can see here, had a pocket, in his pocket he had a photograph of his fiancée, again a sort of fabricated relationship. And in his briefcase, which was attached to him, he had vital plans and letters confirming that the Allies were going to invade Greece. And this eventually found its way into the hands of the Nazis, and it was indeed a success. So Fleming was involved as the deputy of Godfrey in this mission, and it was based on a memo called the Trout Memo, which compared deception to luring trout with flies, and that was most likely that was Fleming's brainchild. A less successful operation he got involved in was called RUTHLESS, and this was a plan to capture one of the main objectives of the war, the Enigma machine, the naval Enigma encryption machine, which was deemed to be unbreakable. The code was deemed to be unbreakable. There were so many possible settings. But Fleming came up with a plot to steal the German Enigma code books by faking a crash. A captured German bomber would be placed in the English Channel, and a German rescue boat would come and rescue it, as Fleming planned, and then the British would kill all the German sailors and steal their Enigma book. Again, it sounds sort of like a James Bond mission. In reality, it didn't work. There were no German rescue boats on the English Channel at the time, so it wasn't a success. And not only that, but Fleming was told by his boss, "You're not taking part in this. You're not going to be part of this crew. You know too much. If you were captured, it would be a disaster for naval intelligence." So this is an example of another important thing that in reality often was disappointing for Ian Fleming. It didn't live up to his expectations, and he wasn't able to be the man of action that he thought of his father, who was killed in World War I, as a war hero. And Ian could never live up to that. And so he creates James Bond eventually as a sort of alter ego who where everything turns out right in the end. The operations are successful and he's at the heart of the action. An example of how he transfers these experiences into fiction is from Russia with Love, the fifth Bond novel, which is based on a British intelligence capturing the Spectre machine, as it's called, which is sort of based on the Enigma machine. It's a Soviet encryption machine, decoding machine. Eventually, in reality, as we know, Bletchley Park and Alan Turing in particular were central to the decryption of the Enigma traffic. That's a picture of the young Alan Turing. But in Fleming's plot, James Bond is the one who will try to capture the machine. Although he's actually less successful than you might think, and this is true of a number of the novels, that he's not by any means a superhero. Another influential event was Fleming coming up with his own commando unit called 30 AU, or 30 Assault Unit. And he was authorized by Godfrey to do this and to send his men into occupied Europe behind the enemy forces as the Allied forces made progress into occupied Europe. Fleming's commandos would go and capture the intelligence of the enemy before they could destroy it. And they came up some amazing hauls, including the German Naval Archive, was probably the biggest scoop they got. But this, again, some of the characters that Fleming knew and recruited for 30 AU were influential on the character of James Bond, who has that kind of commando, adventurous man of action. So I'm going to turn now to Jamaica. So back to GoldenEye. Here we are in GoldenEye. This is the picture of the house from the outside. Quite a modest bungalow, not a palatial house by any means, but it served Fleming's purpose as the place to escape from the winter in Britain, which is pretty wretched, and to find time eventually to write. It had the perfect location on the cliffs of the Oracabessa on the north shore of Jamaica. It had its own private beach. And here's Fleming at the desk that I'm at right now. As you see, he's typing away there. He liked to work in the mornings and then go snorkeling in the reef. He got to do this because he had a job as foreign manager of Kemsley newspapers, and he was specifically foreign manager for the Sunday Times, which was owned by Lord Kemsley. And when Kemsley offered him the job, Fleming said, "I'll take it, but only if you give me 2 months paid leave every year." And Kemsley was rather shocked at this effrontery, but agreed. And so it gave Fleming the license then to disappear between January and March every year from 1946, when he built the house, until his death in 1964. So he'd be there every winter. He first went to Jamaica with his close friend back from Eton school days, Ivor Bryce, who was a fascinating character in his own right, and ended up also working in intelligence in World War II. But Bryce married a very wealthy heiress who owned a beautiful house, Bellevue, in Jamaica. And Ian and Ivor went there to a conference, a naval conference about a U-boat, problem of U-boats in the Atlantic. And Ivor invited Ian to stay at his house. And apparently it was awful time. The weather was terrible. It rained the whole time. Also, the house hadn't been provisioned properly with, they liked their drinks and they liked nice food. So Ivor apologized on the way back that it hadn't worked out. And Ian said, "I'm going to live there after the war and write books." So something about Jamaica had grabbed his imagination. And Jamaica is really the key to Fleming as a writer. Without this place, I don't believe he would ever have finally got down to the writing from 1952, when he wrote Casino Royale. Jamaica was emerging as a tourist destination while Fleming lived there, particularly in the 50s, for a more kind of affluent, class of tourists. And a friend of his, Noel Coward, the famous playwright, built a house right next to Fleming's called Firefly, called Blue Harbor, and then another extension, Firefly, and they were very close. So Fleming spent many of the winters really socializing with this sort of jet set and friends of his, and enjoying the natural beauty of Jamaica. Before he got down to writing, so it took him some time. Some of the most successful novels that he wrote are set in Jamaica. In the first novel, Casino Royale, Bond's controller is based in Jamaica. So even though it's a European-based novel, he gets Jamaica in there. But starting with Live and Let Die, the second novel in the series, Jamaica plays a central role as Bond's assigned to investigate a smuggling ring of 17th century gold coins, Captain Morgan's treasure, which is on an island off the coast of Jamaica. And it's a real island, but he called it the Isle of Surprise in the novel. And so the villain of this novel is Haitian born. His name is Mr. Big, and he's running a smuggling operation, but he's also a SMERSH agent for the Soviet Union, and he's using the profits from this smuggling to fund SMERSH operations in the US. So it's of course connected very much to the Cold War. Bond travels to Jamaica then to track down Mr. Big and try to defeat his plot. And I just want to read one of the descriptions of Jamaica, which tells you how much it meant to Fleming. He writes, "The road wound down towards the northern plains through some of the most beautiful scenery in the world, the tropical vegetation changing with the altitude." There's a lot of this very, these sort of flourishes of description of natural landscapes of Jamaica, which tells you how much Fleming loved the country. Those of you who've seen the film Live and Let Die will probably remember that it's actually called San Monique, partly because they'd already used Jamaica for a previous film, which Dr. No, which is the first Bond novel to be adapted for the cinema, but the sixth that Fleming wrote. So the first film also used Jamaica as a setting. Ironically, this was the year that Jamaica became independent from Britain. It had been a crown colony for centuries, and based on the slave plantations and sugar as a key export. Britain had been a very profitable colony for Britain for many centuries. It became independent in 1962, which is the same year that Dr. No, the film, was released, and was set in Jamaica. And Fleming was actually there writing one of his novels at the time, so he became quite involved in the production, and he got to see how important his beloved his kind of Caribbean oasis became for the film. Talking of Dr. No, here's a still of Ursula Andress as Honey Rider, the first cinematic sort of classic Bond girl. But I want to talk more deeply about Fleming's relationships with women, because they really, although we think of James Bond, as this sort of very macho, perhaps very hero, and Bond girls as sort of sexual objects sometimes in the films. Fleming's relationships with women were much more complex than that would suggest. And so I wanted to just go over some of the relationships that I argue in my biography really influenced his female characters in the novels. Perhaps his first great love was called quite a name, Monique Panchaud de Bottomes, who was the daughter of a businessman in Switzerland. And Fleming met Monique in 1930 when he was studying at the University of Geneva. He never went to university in the UK, interestingly, unlike Peter, who was a star at Oxford University. Ian, he studied abroad, and there was always something that attracted him to being abroad, or being away from England. In any case, he met Monique and they fell in love. But when they actually became engaged, but when Monique visited the Fleming family in England, his mother was determined to break off the relationship, because she, first of all, didn't want Ian to be distracted from his career prospects, but also didn't feel that Monique was of the suitable class to marry her son. And Ian was devastated. He was sort of heartbroken by this termination of the love affair. And we get a sense of how important she was, because when later he wrote about James Bond's parentage, he gave the name Monique to James Bond's mother. So clearly he carried her in his memory, as he did with another of his great early loves, Muriel Wright. Perhaps even a more tragic story, because by all accounts, including my own research, Muriel was sort of adoring and sort of worshipped Ian Fleming, would run all his errands for him and get his rations during the war. When there were everything was rationed, all the kind of foods and gasoline and cigarettes and everything. She would look after him. But Ian was averse to getting married. He didn't want to commit. And in the end, she was killed in an air raid. She was actually asleep in her house when a bomb hit the house, and a piece of shrapnel hit her on the head. And again, Ian was devastated. He had to go and identify her body, and he was racked with guilt because he felt he had not declared his feelings for her and had missed an opportunity to perhaps find happiness. So sort of maybe a bit selfish, he was more thinking about how it affected him. But the point is that he was traumatized by this, and he again worked this into his novels, where some of his heroines, some of the most interesting heroines, I think, Vesper Lind in Casino Royale, and Tracy Di Vincenzo, who Bond actually marries. He actually does get married in one of the novels. But both of them die very horribly and very suddenly, and they both have strong traces of Muriel. Fleming did eventually marry. He'd been very reluctant to commit, although he had a long-standing affair with Anne, who was when he first met was Anne O'Neill. She was married to Lord O'Neill, an Irish peer, and they began an affair. Ian and her began an affair. There was sort of an obsession, a kind of attraction that would not die, despite they were very different personalities. Shane O'Neill was killed in World War II. That she'd become estranged from her husband, and she was hoping that Ian would then propose, as they'd been involved, but he got cold feet and didn't. So she married someone else, Viscount Rothermere, who was another newspaper baron. And at this point, perhaps you think the affair would end, but no, Ian was still obsessed with Anne, even though he was afraid to marry. And she obviously was still attracted to him, because they continued after GoldenEye was built to have liaisons there. She would visit with a friend as a kind of cover for their relationship. But eventually, Rothermere had enough. He probably had found out that Anne was pregnant with a child that was not his, and so Rothermere finally had enough and divorced Anne. And at this point, Ian decided, now that he's a father, potentially, Anne is pregnant with his child, he has to get married. And he claimed that he wrote Casino Royale to take his mind off the anxiety of, at the age of 44, after a long bachelor life, to kind of give up that life for marriage and fatherhood. He says he wrote Casino Royale. I think there were a number of reasons. That may have been one of the catalysts. But in any case, he wrote the novel in 1952. It was published in 1953, and Caspar, their only child, was born in August 1952. But the Fleming marriage was not really a happy one. They drifted further and further apart, and Fleming, grew more and more to love the Jamaican trips, not just because he wanted to write the Bond novels, but because he loved the climate, and he loved the people he knew there, and fell out of love with Jamaica, perhaps fell out of love with Ian as well, but she didn't want to go anymore. And so Ian became attracted to a Jamaican woman, a wealthy heiress called Blanche Blackwell. And it started really as a friendship, because they both loved the outdoors. They both loved to kind of horse riding and snorkeling and kayaking, and the things that Anne wasn't interested in. Anne was much more of a socialite. She liked to be surrounded by successful authors and literary people. And Ian, although he was a writer, didn't like that scene at all. So he was much more, he wanted to enjoy the Jamaican landscape, and Blanche was a friend that he could do that with. I should mention also that another friend of Ian's, Maud Russell, another woman who became his lover, but was really more of a friendship, gave Ian the money to buy the land and build the house, GoldenEye. she was so such a great friend. She wanted him to realize his dream. She knew he had this dream of living in Jamaica after the war, writing books, and she wanted to make it reality. So she gave him this £4,000, which was a lot of money at that time, to build the house. And you know, without Maud, perhaps we wouldn't have had James Bond. It's worth keeping that in mind. But back to Blanche, they eventually did become lovers, and she looked after the house. There's a kind of interesting story. She would plant things in the garden while Ian was not there, and when Anne came to visit, she would tear them out of the soil because she was upset that Ian had a mistress there, had a lover. But Blanche had also an influence on the female characters in the later novels, characters like Honey Rider from Dr. No, who you can more like the kind of Amazon figure, very, very outside, very independent, very active, can fight for themselves. Pussy Galore is another of the later characters, who's a gangster in the novel. These very independent, active, and sometimes violent women are kind of based somewhat on Blanche Blackwell. Fleming eventually, his lifestyle took its toll. He was a heavy smoker. If you've read any Bond novels, you might remember that James Bond is sometimes reported as smoking his 70th cigarette of the day, or which sounds extreme, but that was more or less what Fleming smoked. He was a chain smoker, and of course it took its toll on his health. He also loved to drink. Bond's martini drinking, which is famous. He's shaken, not stirred. Fleming liked the martinis, and this all took its toll on his health. He had a heart attack in 1961, and he survived that, but he was told not to write about James Bond when he was in hospital. But he was determined to do something, so he decided to write a story for his son Caspar while he was recovering, and that story was eventually published as Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. So in addition to James Bond, Fleming's create one of the most famous children's books that also became a successful film. But he didn't really cut back on his drinking and smoking. I mean, he cut back somewhat, but he wouldn't quit, is what I'm saying. He wouldn't really, to prolong his life. He said, "I'm not going to give up my pleasures to prolong my life." That was not something he was interested in. And eventually, he had another heart attack in 1964. He was at his beloved Royal St George's golf course in Sandwich in Kent, where he'd just been appointed club captain. It was a very proud moment for him, and sadly, that was when he had his fatal heart attack. Also, sadly, he died on his son's birthday. So there's a certain there's a poignant, coincidence there, I suppose. He lived long enough to see the first two Bond films, Dr. No and From Russia with Love. Goldfinger was also being produced while he was alive, but he never saw the finished film, which is ironic because Goldfinger was the film that really launched the Bond particularly in the American market as a huge phenomenon. But he knew that the films were successful, but it also had some severe setbacks, particularly around the film he started called Thunderball, which began as a collaboration between Ian and a screenwriter Jack Whittingham and a producer Kevin McClory. But Ian was charged with plagiarizing their screenplay for his novel, and the stress around this court case, which was eventually upheld, probably accelerated his death as well. He's buried in Wiltshire in Sevenhampton. That's his gravestone in the churchyard there. So with the death of Fleming, James Bond was sort of cut loose to be on his own, to fend for himself, so to speak. But he was already on a good path with Eon Productions, with Dr. No, directed by Terence Young. And now, as we speak today, there have been 25 official Bond movies. So clearly the legacy of James Bond has lasted well after Fleming's death. he's been played in this official series by 6 actors. There's one of them. I'm sure you recognize Daniel Craig. Here are some of the others. You may recognize the one on the left, Sean Connery, Roger Moore, Pierce Brosnan is there at the bottom, and then Daniel Craig, and then Timothy Dalton. One of the secrets, I want to call it one of the secrets of the James Bond series, is this gentleman, George Lazenby, who only made 1 Bond film, but it was a very important one because it's the film in which Bond got married, and in which we find out some of Bond's secrets, that he does fall passionately in love with Tracy, and he also quits the Secret Service. 2 unthinkable developments for James Bond, right? To quit the Secret Service, in which he's become the star 00 agent, and to get married, and then decides he needs to leave the service to but then it ends in tragedy as Tracy is killed by Blofeld, his nemesis. And some of the Daniel Craig films particularly delve into this secret past of James Bond. I think it's very interesting that it actually brings it closer to Fleming's Bond, because Fleming's Bond is not a sort of 2-dimensional superhero. He's a quite tormented character in many ways, with traumas in his past and lots of doubts about his work. He sometimes has horrible crises of conscience about killing people for a living. So there's a lot more of that dark side to the Bond secrets, which Daniel Craig films have dwelt on, with Skyfall, where Bond's interviewed by a psychoanalyst, and he walks out when the analyst kind of hits a nerve by mentioning his childhood home, Skyfall. And then in the next film, Spectre, there's a lot to say about that. I don't have time to delve into it, but it really delves again into Bond's traumatized childhood, the death of his father, being raised by a surrogate father, Hans Oberhauser, and Spectre kind of brings back these secrets of Bond's childhood, which again are closer to the James Bond of Fleming's novels, and indeed to Ian Fleming, because as I mentioned earlier, Fleming was kind of partially orphaned, so to speak, when his father was killed, when Fleming was only 9. And even the most recent film, No Time to Die, and Daniel Craig's last in the role, features these secrets about Bond's past, the woman he's had a child with, and that again is another kind of almost unthinkable step for a James Bond character to have a child. That seems so not what James Bond's character has been, but it's another sense in which the past comes back to haunt James Bond, and he can't really escape it. And also worth mentioning, this film returns James Bond to Jamaica. Bond has retired to Jamaica, and that's where he's sort of dragged into this international plot by his old friend Felix Leiter. So in some ways, this film kind of comes full circle back to the Ian Fleming James Bond, where we began the character. And certainly, if we look at Fleming's legacy, I think it's fair to say Bond is one of the most famous fictional characters in the world. His name is sort of a worldwide recognition. One poll calculated that between a third and a half of the world's population had seen a James Bond film. But perhaps less well known is Fleming's secret world of his imagination, and how much that went into the original character. Fleming and Bond in many ways were mirror images. He gave Bond many of his own traits and much of his own past experiences, but as a sort of superior version of himself. That is, someone who was as irresistible to women as Fleming wanted to be, was as heroic and in action and courageous as Fleming wanted to be, and who had all these opportunities for amazing adventures. Fleming once said, "You should never say no to adventures. You should always say yes." And that's something that he tried to live out, but certainly Bond did live out. And since Fleming's death, Bond's taken on a different life of his own. He's become more famous. James Bond has become more famous than Ian Fleming, his creator. And yet Fleming was the creative mind of James Bond, and we're indebted to him for that amazing series of novels and films. So that's my presentation. Just leave you with another publication that you might be interested in. This is actually on Diamonds Are Forever, the James Bond novel that took a different turn in many ways from the Smersh sort of Cold War novels, but was made into a film in 1971, Guy Hamilton film. And I put together a collection of essays from many great scholars on different aspects, the many facets of Diamonds Are Forever, which is published by Lexington Books. It's now available in paperback as well, which is great. So thank you again for inviting me to present. I hope you found something interesting, and I'll be happy to take any questions if anyone has.
Great. Thank you very much, Oliver. Just as a reminder, if you have a question for Dr. Buckton, please open up the Q&A box and you can type your questions there. Oliver, you mentioned that there are up to today 25 movies that have been made, that official movies that feature James Bond. How many of those are actually based on one of Ian Fleming's books?
Oh, that's a great question. It's kind of a difficult question to answer because there are elements of Fleming's books in films that might not seem obvious. I mean, so really the first during the Sean Connery really for the let's say for the 1960s, I would say that the films are based pretty closely on the novels. So Dr. No, Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball. You Only Live Twice actually is based on Fleming's novel, but it makes some significant changes. On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the Lazenby film that I mentioned is also based very closely on the novel, which is great because I think it's a great novel. Then with Diamonds Are Forever, it is based on Fleming's novel, but they start to really drift off the plot. They really start to take kind of liberties, if you like, or just poetic license. Live and Let Die as well. It's based on Fleming's novel. So really, up to the last film that uses a Fleming title is The Living Daylights in 1987, which is based on a short story that Fleming wrote. A very, very interesting short story, Cold War Berlin short story, but they incorporate plot elements in other films. So License to Kill, for example, 1989, they incorporate some plot elements from Live and Let Die, Fleming's novel, which were not used in the film of Live and Let Die, but they were just too good not to use. There's an amazing scene where the characters are actually, I mean, there's influence of Fleming throughout. I would even argue that in GoldenEye, the film GoldenEye, which has the same name as Fleming's house. It was Pierce Brosnan's first Bond film after a long hiatus when we thought perhaps there would be no more Bond films. But GoldenEye was named after a mission in World War II that Fleming was involved in, and so that's what he used for his home. But the golden eye of the film has nothing to do with Jamaica, nothing to do with the Fleming's house or the operation. But I would argue that some of the plot is based a little bit on Moonraker, one of Fleming's early novels. So it's kind of complicated, but it's clear that the filmmakers now have kind of, have a kind of carte blanche to develop new plots and new characters. Like I said, I don't think Fleming would have. Well, who knows? I mean, what he would have thought of James Bond having a child, I don't know. But
how many James Bond novels were there? You mentioned that he also wrote a few others, but how many James Bond novels?
So 12 novels and then 2 collections of short stories as well.
Great.
One of which was posthumous. So.
Yeah, I want to get to some of our audience's questions. One very interesting question here is, given that Ian Fleming was born in the early 20th century and into a very wealthy, if not rich family, and given those socioeconomic standards that he was born into, what do you think Ian Fleming would have thought about the ideas of having a Black actor play James Bond?
What would Fleming have thought of that? I think he would have been I think he would have been kind of surprised at the idea. It's interesting because he has some very important Black characters. I'm particularly thinking of Quarrel, who's Bond's sort of trainer and sort of assistant, I suppose, in Live and Let Die, and then Dr. No. And he's, he has skills that Bond doesn't have. He's in some ways, Bond recruits him to train him to face these terrible adversaries, because Quarrel, has amazing sort of survival skills, and he knows Jamaica like the back of his hand, and in some ways he's superior to Bond, and as in terms of fitness and so on. So it's not that Fleming couldn't imagine a kind of Black action hero,
right.
But I think he would have, he thought of Bond as a sort of the English gentleman, and even like Sean Connery, who became so iconic, was not quite right in Fleming's mind. He was working class.
And that was actually my next question for you, Oliver. Extending that a bit, given that Ian Fleming lived to see two of the movies being made, what did he think about Sean Connery and the movies that are being made? What did he think? Yeah, what did Ian Fleming think about the movies and Sean Connery in the role of James Bond?
He was enthusiastic, even I might even say desperate, to get a Bond on screen. I mean, he made so many attempts. He'd fly out to Hollywood to meet with producers. He would talk to film producers. He would try to write. He tried to get Alexander Korda, the great film producer who produced The Third Man film, to produce Live and Let Die. And Korda sort of said, "I don't think it's really going to work for film. Maybe you should write something for film." So he wrote Moonraker with film in mind, but again, it didn't really go anywhere. So he was trying really hard. I mean, he saw this was the key to make Bond the success that he wanted. So he was totally thrilled that finally Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman formed Eon Productions and made this deal with him. He was disappointed that he'd sold the rights to Casino Royale, which is why it took so long to make that. So he was thrilled. Like I say, his idea though was Bond was more of the English gentleman. Yeah. His idea of James Bond was his good friend David Niven, the English screen actor, who's a wonderful actor, but totally different from Sean Connery. I mean,
very different. Yes.
He would have been and I think the producers realized that the screen character was not going to be the same as Ian Fleming's character. So there was a bit of ambivalence with Fleming. He wanted James Bond to be, a film character. He loved the fact they were making films, but then he saw the character kind of taken away from him. That it now belonged to someone else. And Sean Connery, he once complained that on the cover of one of the paperbacks of his novels, I think it was Goldfinger, he said Sean Connery's name is bigger than mine on the cover. So there was a bit of ambivalence, but he did love. He did come to actually really admire Connery, and realize that this was a different medium, and Connery was right for the part. So he liked Connery a lot.
During Fleming's lifetime, were any of his books financial success?
They were. I mean, but not to the level that he wanted. I mean, again, there was a bit of ambivalence that Fleming, he wanted to be a popular best-selling writer, but he also wanted a certain level of kind of literary, credibility. And so he went with Jonathan Cape. It's a very, very reputable publisher, published sort of major writers. Jonathan Cape, though, they would never print enough copies. Fleming was always writing to them saying, "You need to print more copies of my books. They're going to sell out. You need to give me more royalties." He was also always threatening to leave Cape and go somewhere else. So the books were, particularly, I think Goldfinger was a big turning point. But even before that, From Russia with Love was a very successful novel, which is interesting because at the end of From Russia with Love, Bond had apparently been killed off. Fleming was tired of writing Bond. He's for him, the novels weren't successful enough. And he thought, I'm not going to get anywhere. The films aren't really going, the film idea is not, I'm going to just kill off the character and do something else. So he left Bond apparently dead. And then Russia with Love was such a huge success, he had to bring him back to life and explain how, miraculously Bond had recovered from fatal poisoning. So by most standards, yes, the novels were commercially successful. But really the success happened when they went into paperback. He made very good deals with Pan and New American Library for paperback versions. And then, of course, when the film started appearing and the movie tie-in books, then they were off the charts. But unfortunately, Fleming was dead. So
yeah. We're almost out of time. I know we have a couple of more questions here. We will get to all of the questions and put the answers on our website. I'm going to conclude us here with one last question. And there are actually two questions here that are very similar. What do you think is the future of James Bond? Do you think there will be additional films? Will there any impact on advanced technology on James Bond and how James Bond develops further? It already has developed into something a little bit new, right? With the different environment, different technology that we have nowadays from when Ian Fleming lived. Do you have any guess on where the story of James Bond will be going from here?
Oh, wow. That's I wish I could. I'd probably, be writing books about that. But I mean, I think since you mentioned technology, I think one interesting thing is how the Bonds have varied by kind of technology. Obviously, one of the selling points was technology in the early films, the Q, right? The Q and all the gadgets and the kind of customized cars and at certain points it's gone almost off the charts with Bond going to space and but I think they've kind of reined it in a bit with Daniel Craig. There's that interesting scene in Skyfall when he complains about all he's been given is a gun and a little radio and says it's not exactly Christmas, is it? So he's so if you're talking about technology in that sense, I think they've reined it in with Daniel Craig. But in terms of the technology of making the films, I mean, the budgets have just kind of multiplied, so the kind of whether there'll be more CGIs and I kind of hope not more. I like the fact they're filmed on location. That I've been to some of the locations. And amazing to sort of see the real places. But I think the big question, of course, is who's going to be James Bond. I think there will be more films. I don't see them quitting.
Right.
I do think Daniel Craig is a tremendously difficult act to follow. I think he transformed the character for the 21st century and for a new generation of Bond fans. I think he's a wonderful actor, and I think wish him all the best, but it's going to be very hard to fill his shoes. I think the big question is whether they go in a completely different direction, will they have a black James Bond? I believe that I believe that the Barbara and Michael, the producers, have said they won't have a female James Bond. I'm pretty confident they've said that.
I know that it was under discussion at some point.
It was under discussion, and of course there was a black female 007 in No Time to Die.
Yep.
So it kind of teased everyone with this idea that this is a revolution. We're going to have a black woman as James Bond. I don't think they're going to do that because they're looking at the demographics of their audience, and they want this to remain, they're worried about anything that might reduce the appeal. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be a great James Bond, but I'm pretty confident it'll be a male actor. But I think they might take the opportunity with Daniel Craig to go in a very different direction. Let's put it that way. And because I don't think they can get, someone too like Daniel Craig because it would just be always comparing to him.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Oliver. We're out of time. We'll have you answer the remaining questions offline, and then we'll post the answers on our website. So thank you again. Thank you everybody for calling in. Very fascinating presentation, and I hope to see everybody again in 2 weeks for our next Research in Action.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.